Hello and welcome to this video that serves as complementary material to my Substack post redefining chess strategy. In this video I would like to show you one line that has developed relatively recently where white embarks, well actually both players embark on sacrificial road in what is commonly considered a strategic and positional structure, the Carlsbad structure. While I'm at it, I will also point out the other video I made showing AlphaZero's novel plan in the Carlsbad structure. You can find it on my YouTube channel. Whereas in this video, I will show you another line that is also very exciting. So after the moves d4, d5, c4, e6, knight c3, I have to note that, for example, in my chessable course for white 1d4, I recommend the move order of taking on d5 first as a way of entering the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. The reason being that after knight c3, black has additional options. One, for example, a popular one is the Shah-Hennig Gambit, c5, c takes d5, and c takes d4. And another one, very popular, is after knight f6, c takes d5, the move knight takes d5, which leads to the semi-Tarrasch variation made popular by Kramnik and still a very, very reliable weapon for black in modern practice. So in order to avoid this, I think it's more practical to take on d5 on move 3. So let's continue with the game. Carlsbad structure, cd5, ed5, and now the move bishop f4. This is a relatively modern twist because for decades the automatic move has been the move bishop g5. Obviously makes sense to pin the knight and the bishop is active on the h4 d8 diagonal. But recently, since black has found many ways to counter bishop g5, white bishop g5 remains a popular option obviously, but white tried to deviate at earlier stages, hence the move bishop f4 became more prominent. So now with the bishop on f4, black can continue in more than one way. One natural way is to go bishop d6 to exchange the bishops, and after bishop d6, queen d6, e3, we still have the Carlsbad structure where white would like to continue bishop d3 to stop the development of the bishop to f5, and if black plays bishop f5, then the ideas like queen b3 are possible, attacking the pawn on b7 and so forth. So the line I would like to show you starts after the move c6, e3, and now bishop f5. Bishop d6 again is possible, but bishop e7 is, for example, already dubious, even though it's a natural move, because after something like bishop d3, white obtains the ideal setup in the Carlsbad because he managed to stop the development of black's bishop to f5. So bishop d3 controls that square, and then white can choose even where to castle. There are two possible plans after queen c2. One is to go queenside castling after long castle, and the other one is kingside castling, let's say after knight f3 or knight e2 to go short castle, and then most likely prepare the minority attack with rook b1, b4, and so on. In case of long castle, white will attack on the king side with h3, g4, and so on. Therefore, bishop f5 is the best move. Black develops the bishop on the most active diagonal. And now, in this position, white should follow one of these rules of thumb that I devised for my course, and that is that the moment the bishop appears on f5, white should immediately start harassing it. And this is done in several ways. For example, in the course I recommend the move knight g2, the idea being knight g3 to harass the bishop on f5. Another idea to harass the bishop is to go knight f3 and then harass it with knight h4. And the third option, which we will see in this line, is the move f3. The move f3 is a preparation of g4 or maybe even later e4. So f3, white most likely prepares g4 to harass that bishop on f5. So this is a very useful rule of thumb to remember for white, that immediately the bishop comes to f5, it should be attacked as soon as possible. And as I explained, these are the ways to do so. Now this is a very important position, even though it's only move 7. In fact, black has a very limited choice if he wants to obtain a satisfactory position from the opening. For example, I will give you kind of a high-level example that even a player like Magnus Carlsen, when he did not play the best move in this position, he quickly ended up in a very bad position and lost in mere 24 moves to Alexei Sarana. So in this position, Carlsen recognized the threat of g4 and played the move h5, but that is a bad move because it weakens the king side. So Sarana continued naturally with bishop d3. Normally this is considered as a success for black if the light squared bishops are exchanged, but here there are two factors that work in white's favor, and that is that after bishop d3, queen d3, first and foremost, black's king side has been weakened with the move h5, so white has access to the g5 square, for example, and second, thanks to the move f3, white can very quickly establish a full pawn center with d4, e4, which can further serve as basis for an attack on the king side. And this happened after knight a6, knight g2, knight c7 and e4. White already has an advantage. And after d takes e4, f takes e4, knight e6, short castle, white already had a very big advantage because he has a full center, very harmonious development, and chances to attack black's king, which is still stuck in the center. In case of short castle, white can easily move his pieces to the king side and attack there. As I mentioned, the game was Sarana Carlsen from the Almaty World Championship and in 2022, and it was won by white in mere 24 moves. So even Carlsen didn't manage to cope with the opening problems in this position. So in a way it's understandable, because as I will show you which the best move is, you will understand that to enter those complications after the best move, one needs to have either a very good memory or at least to have revised the preparation, the lines before the game. To show you some other moves that are not so great, for example, bishop d6, it's already late for this because after g4, white again has a very pleasant position. It's notable to understand that after bishop takes f4, e takes f4, these two doubled pawns on the f file are in white's favor. And the reason for this is that they control all the important squares in the center, e4, e5, and thanks to the pawn being on f3 controlling the e4 square, white can advance with the doubled pawn, the one on f4, by pushing f5, g5 and so on. So an illustrative line, for example, let's say bishop drops back to c8, now knight g2, let's say queen d6, queen d2, short castle, let's say knight g3, and now the pawns are ready to advance. Ideas like knight f5, h4, everything is coming. And in case of a check, simply king f2, the king is again very safe on f2 thanks to this pawn controlling both e4 and g4 squares, so the knight is very limited and cannot inflict any damage on those two squares. So these positions are generally quite favorable for white. So going back, let's say bishop d6, h6 is a more modest way than Carlsen's h5. It doesn't stop g4, but it does free the h7 square for the bishop, but it doesn't solve all problems. g4, bishop h7, h4, and again it's clear that black will have very difficult time castling kingside here because the attack is coming immediately after g5. So having taken space on the king side, white has really, again, very comfortable play. The knight is coming to g3, maybe the bishops will be exchanged with bishop d3, and then the knight will come to f5, and with a very good position for white. So the best move in this position, in fact, is the move knight h5. Black takes advantage of the fact that the f3 pawn blocks the queen's access to the d1 h5 diagonal, and black in turn harasses the bishop on f4. But you notice that the move, actually knight h5, puts both the knight on h5 and the bishop on f5 in the line of fire of the pawn after g4, forking both. So after bishop takes b8, removing the bishop from f4 with tempo, rook takes b8 and g4, you could easily think that, oops, what happened here? Black is losing a piece. But this is just the start of the complications. And now you slowly start to realize this modern line of the Carlsbad structure, how difficult it is to play, and perhaps understand Carlsen not wanting to enter this territory. The only way for black not to lose material is to give the check on h4, king d2 and knight g3. So using the pin on the h file, black is going after the rook on h1. But we continue the line. G takes f5, knight takes h1. Now the knight wants to escape via f2, and now knight h3 is the correct move to stop the knight from escaping. The point being that knight f2, queen e1, white wins the knight because the knight cannot move as the queen on h4 is hanging. So what we have here is a very strange position, definitely not typical for the Carlsbad, with the white's king on d2, knight on h1, all pieces scattered all over the board. And we can imagine the scenario that white will win that knight on h1 and we'll have two knights for a rook. And under normal circumstances, you would say, okay, that's just winning, a winning material advantage. But as we will see, in this line, black manages to obtain a counterplay against white's king in the center, even though this is not as straightforward and doesn't look even very obvious because the king looks pretty safely defended in the center. So again, to show some illustrative lines, for example, bishop d6 here is not so good because queen e2 prevents knight f2 and defends the pawn on h2, because the bishop was attacking it, and threatens queen g2 to pick up the knight. And for example, short castle, queen g2, white manages to consolidate b5, let's say, bishop d3, b4, knight e2, and white consolidated, finished development, the knight will fall, and white can also use the g file, for example, rook g1, to create threats on the king side. So you see how easily it is for black to fail to create sufficient counterplay against white's king. So going back, the best way to create counterplay is to play the move bishop b4. So developing and pinning that knight on c3. Now white has a choice. I have analyzed here a3 as the best move, immediately attacking that bishop on b4. But there is also, for example, bishop g2, short castle, queen e1, seeking exchange of queens, because obviously in an endgame white would be winning, as the counterplay against white's centralized king will be non-existent. But now queen h6 should be played, and the threat is c5. And now you see the outline of black's counterplay. So there is a pin on the c1 h6 diagonal, especially that pawn on e3. So c5, dc5, d4 is one of black's threats. So let's say a3, bishop d6, queen h1, and now b5. And now we see another subtlety of the development of the bishop to b4. So by forcing a3, it may appear that black lost a tempo. So we saw the line with bishop d6 that wasn't sufficient. And the reason it wasn't sufficient was that when black played b4, white could simply play knight e2 and nothing was happening on the queen side. But now with the pawn on a3, b4 would actually lead to opening of some files. So either a b4 or ba3, and the b file will be opened, and this will give black counterplay. So you see how subtle modern preparation, modern lines are, or at least can be. So bishop b4 in order to provoke a3, so that later on b5, b4 comes with an attack on that pawn on a3, leading to opening of files. So now you understand after a3 bishop d6 the idea behind the provoking of a3. For example, now queen e2, which was working in the other line, b5, queen g2, attacking also g7, short castle, bishop d3, and this was working great for white, but now b4 does give black enough counterplay, as now knight e2 would be after ba3 would lead to the opening of the b file, which definitely provides sufficient counterplay for black. So bishop g2 instead, short castle, queen h1, and b5, the same idea, threatening b4. You now get a better understanding of how black's counterplay develops in this line. The main idea being b4, opening files, and also c5. So white can try to stop both by, let's say, queen e1 first, improving the position of the queen by offering the exchange of queens, queen h5, attacking the pawn on f5, and now b4. Again, makes sense, stops b4, stops c5. So, to reiterate, if white manages to stabilize the position, prevent the opening of the position, he would have a winning advantage, because the knights would definitely be superior to a rook, especially as there are no open files. But as it happens, black has just enough. Yeah. a5, the only way to keep some, to try to open files, rook b1, defending the pawn on b4, queen takes f5, knight f2, improving the position of the knight, a takes b4, a takes b4, bishop takes h2 now. Yeah. Black in the meantime managed to pick up 2 pawns while white was consolidating, and let's say something like knight d3, and this is the end of my analysis. For example, with a pretty murky position, white managed to consolidate, the king is safe for the time being, but black has one open file on the queen side, has a passed pawn on the h file, and white still needs to work to activate actually his pieces, so it's kind of a pretty unclear position. So this is a line that could never have existed in the past. For example, when Botvinnik was playing his model games in the Carlsbad. But thanks to the engines, we discover these lines nowadays, and we deepen our understanding of openings and the Carlsbad structure in particular. So going back to our position on move 7, for example, you now understand why Carlsen perhaps was not so willing to enter these complications, because it has to be said that there is more pressure on black playing this line, because if black fails to be precise and create counterplay in the variations that follow, he's immediately lost, because white has the material advantage. So there's more pressure for black to be precise, to be exact, to create this counterplay and keep practical chances alive. So I would conclude therefore this analysis of this modern line in the Carlsbad structure, in the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit. I hope it was instructive, hope you learned something. Please check my socials, my Chessable courses, my Substack, weekly newsletter. You can see the details in the video description. And well, I will thank you for watching, and see you again soon. Take care.